Hey there everyone, Rambling Collector here, and welcome back to another episode of Let's Read. So for the subject of this video, we're going to be diving into the works of Tom Clarke, with his book, Fence Line. Now, if you all have seen my review about this, you'll know that it was a very well done story, and I'm here to read you the first chapter of it to see if you want to check it out for yourself or not. With that being said, let's check it out. Chapter 1. Deployment. U.S. Army Post Fort Wainwright, Fairbanks, Alaska, 1989. It was a brisk 25 degrees above at 0700 hours when U.S. Army First Lieutenant John Page from the 4th Battalion, 9th Infantry arrived at the airfield at Fort Wainwright, Alaska. Stepping out onto the tarmac, Lieutenant Page took a deep breath of the cool fall air, grabbed a rucksack out of the bed of the truck he had been riding in, and waved to the driver who had dropped him off from the headquarters building where he had just received a very short and impromptu briefing about the operation he was about to head out on. Still slightly fascinated by the sight of his own breath, Lieutenant Page took a few deep breaths before walking over to hangar number 4. Striding up to the tarmac side of the hangar, he was greeted by 2 staff sergeants who snapped to attention, as they both delivered a salute just as crisp as the morning air. Returning the salute, Lieutenant Page pulled a piece of paper out of his jacket, looked at it, and then asked, "Staff Sergeant Gillespie and Staff Sergeant Rollins?" "Yes, sir," both men replied in unison. "Well, good morning, then. I'm Lieutenant Page. Looks like I'll be going with you this morning." "Yes, sir," Staff Sergeant Gillespie replied. "We got the word out about 30 minutes ago. If you don't mind, what happened to Lieutenant Littleman?" With a slight grin, Lieutenant Page replied, "It's my understanding that he slipped on the ice this morning in front of his house and broke his ankle." "Ouch!" Staff Sergeant Rollins muttered under his breath as Gillespie grimaced. "Ouch is right," Lieutenant Page replied. "Anyway, bad for him, good for me, I guess. Is everyone here?" "Yes, sir," Gillespie replied. "Lieutenant, if you don't mind me asking, where did you come from, sir? What I mean is, neither of us know you. I know they didn't pull you from another battalion, and don't take this the wrong way, but you're a little older than our run-of-the-mill lieutenants." The morning air suddenly became just a little chillier as Lieutenant Page looked back at Rollins and Gillespie, his icy blue, almost gray eyes projecting the presence of a man who was not to be tangled with. Lieutenant Page's glare gave way to a smile and a head nod, which were both welcome sights to the 2 staff sergeants. "Observant. I like that," Lieutenant Page replied as he took a step closer to Rollins and Gillespie. "I was enlisted, but then did the Green to Gold program. As for where I came from, I just arrived from Korea 2 days ago. I hadn't even finished in processing when I got tasked with this operation. Sound good?" "Yes, sir," both men replied. "Good," Lieutenant Page replied. "Sergeant Gillespie, for the record, I don't mind you asking. It's important that you men know who you're working with, especially when it's for the first time. It wasn't too long ago I was standing right where you are now, so I get it. You have questions? Ask. Just, not my favorite color and whatnot." The 2 staff sergeants gave a quiet chuckle and replied with a "yes, sir." "Sir, maybe you could tell us why they issued us live ammunition for a training exercise?" Staff Sergeant Rollins asked. Lieutenant Page looked both the men individually right in their eyes and replied, "Who said this was a training exercise?" "How are we sitting with your squads?" Lieutenant Page asked as Gillespie and Rollins both looked at each other. "I've got 8 men with 2 on sick call with the flu," Gillespie answered. "I've got 10, sir," Rollins replied. "Good enough," Lieutenant Page replied as he looked at his watch. 20 minutes till we launch. Let's get inside and have a quick briefing." "Are you from Poland, sir?" Rollins asked as they headed for the door to the hangar. "Poland? No. What would make you ask that?" "It's your accent, sir. I can't place it, but I spent a year over there, and it sounds a little Polish," Rollins replied. "Yeah, no, sorry, not Polish. But I'll tell you what, if you guys can guess it, I'll give you all my cocoa packets this entire trip," Lieutenant Page said with a grin. "Well, you've done it now, sir," Gillespie said as he opened the door. "Staff Sergeant Rollins here is fanatical about mixing his cocoa and coffee packets, but always complains about not having enough cocoa." Walking into the large open bay hangar, Lieutenant Page asked, "They told me that you guys would have some extra cold weather gear for me?" "Yes, sir. It's right over there with the rest of the gear," Rollins replied. "Holy shit!" Private First Class Aaron muttered as he and 2 other members of his squad watched Lieutenant Page walk over to the pile of rucksacks and gear with Gillespie and Rollins. "What?" Aaron's roommate, Private First Class Ward, asked him. "Lieutenant, I know him. I mean, I don't know him. I've seen him before. When I was in Korea, that's the dude I was telling you about." "What are you talking about?" Ward asked, looking very confused. "I told you this shit, man," Aaron replied. "I was running some paperwork at the HQ building over there. These 2 bird colonels come out of a conference room shaking their heads. One of them said that guy scares the shit out of me. The other one agreed, and on they went. A few seconds later, that dude came walking out." "That guy? Ward asked, pointing to Lieutenant Page. Yeah, man, that fucking guy, Heron replied. Men, let's gather around, Gillespie yelled, his voice booming through the hangar. As the men of A and B squad quickly moved to gather in front of Staff Sergeant Gillespie, Rollins turned to Lieutenant Page. Sir, you're on. Thank you, Sergeant, Lieutenant Page replied as he stepped in front of the NCOs. Good morning, men. My name's Lieutenant Page. I know you were expecting Lieutenant Littleman, but he had an accident this morning and is at the hospital with a broken ankle. I know that you've all been briefed by your squad leaders about this operation, but I wanted to take a minute and introduce myself and fill in some gaps. First, this is not a training mission, Lieutenant Page continued. We will be relieving an Air Force contingent on the ground. Our destination has been designated Site X-Ray. The mission plan calls for us to insert via CH-47 with a flight time of approximately 2 hours. Once the Air Force folks are relieved, the CH-47 will conduct an air-to-air refueling mission and then return to base. Our time on the ground is anticipated to be 5 days, after which we will be relieved by a fresh Air Force contingent. Any questions so far? With no questions, Lieutenant Page finished his briefing. While at Site X-Ray will be responsible for physical security of the outer perimeter. It's a fence. The area has been treated with motion sensors. If one is tripped, we will respond and investigate. We will be inside a buffer zone. Deadly force is authorized in the event of an incursion. Under no circumstances are we to cross inside the fence line. The good news is that we won't be sleeping in the dirt. There's a command and office building, bunkhouses for each squad, as well as a commo room and holding facility for anyone found to be sniffing around. Sir, one of the soldiers said as he raised his hand. Go, Page said as he pointed at the troop. Sir, didn't you just say deadly force is authorized? Why a holding cell? What's your name, soldier? Lieutenant Page calmly asked as he looked at the young man. Private First Class Heron, sir. Heron. Do I know you, Heron? No, sir. Private First Class Wade and the other soldiers standing around Heron could see that he was becoming physically uncomfortable as Lieutenant Page looked him over. It's a good question, Heron. Thank you, Lieutenant Page replied as he looked away from the young soldier. It's doubtful we will encounter anyone seeing as we're headed to the middle of nowhere, but if we do and they don't resist, just take control of them. Staff Sergeants Gillespie and Rollins will oversee any needed interrogations. When we leave, any prisoners will leave with us and be turned over to military police authorities upon return. Any other questions? Page asked as he looked out over the assembled group. Lieutenant Page then nodded to Gillespie, turned, and walked away as Gillespie clapped his hands together and barked, Okay, just a reminder, this operation is considered to be in theater, so no saluting. I know we've only got the one officer, but he seems okay, so let's keep him. Noise and light discipline, and yes, we will be doing patrols, so make sure you have what you need. We are wheels up in 20 minutes, so let's get this party started. With that, the men dispersed and continued getting ready. Hey, man, where's Lieutenant Page? Gillespie asked, walking over to Rollins. He went outside to oversee the loading of the big stuff, Rollins replied. He said when we're ready to muster on the tarmac. Nodding, Gillespie asked his friend, So, what do you think? He seems cool, Rollins replied. He's certainly not running around with that big stick up his ass that the rest of the lieutenants seem to have, that's for sure. Why, what do you think about him? Rollins asked. I don't know, bro. He seems good, but there's something familiar about him. And not familiar in a good way, you know what I'm saying? It's his eyes. Laughing, Rollins slapped Gillespie on the shoulder. Man, I told you not to drink the wine when you went to church yesterday. Raising his hands up in front of his face as if protecting himself from something, Rollins sarcastically mumbled, It's his eyes. Giving Rollins a playful shoulder shove, Gillespie smiled and replied, Come on, jackass, it's gear check time. Moving to their individual squads, Gillespie and Rollins made sure that the men had the appropriate gear, weapons, and ammunition. When they were done, the entire group, rucksacks on their backs and weapons in hand, headed out to the tarmac to board the CH-47 helicopter that would fly them out to the deployment point. We're ready to go, sir, Rollins hollered as Lieutenant Page came over. Okay, let's get this thing going then, shall we? Lieutenant Page replied. With that, Rollins and Gillespie gave the order for their squads to board the large helicopter. Shuffling up the back ramp, the men each found a spot to settle into the nylon troop seats, doing their best to get comfortable for the flight. Standing at the base of the ramp, Gillespie watched as the last of A's squad moved up and sat down. A strange, uneasy feeling suddenly enveloped him as he started to move up the ramp and join his unit. A feeling that stopped him in his tracks. It was like a darkness had wrapped itself around him, squeezing a little tighter with each step towards the ramp of the aircraft. Are you coming with us, Staff Sergeant? Came the voice of Lieutenant Page, snapping Gillespie out of his trance. Yes, sir. Gillespie shot back as he rolled his shoulders, adjusting his ruck, and then hustling up the ramp as the engines of the large helicopter began running up its engines. Grabbing the first seat he could find closest to the back ramp, Gillespie secured his pack, weapon, and dropped down to the nylon wetting seat. Still like to fly, huh, Wade? With a smile, Gillespie greeted the new chief and friend of his Nick Coffer. Hey, Nick, I didn't know you were on this flight. With a nod from Lieutenant Page as he walked past, Coffer hit the switch to close the ramp. Yeah, I was supposed to be at training in Cali, but it got canceled, so here I am. Hey, man, tough break about Lieutenant Littleman. Shit's fucked up. I hear you, Gillespie replied. Broken ankle's no joke. He's going to be on crutches for a while. Broken ankle? Coffer replied in confusion. Brother, I didn't know about all that. I do know the fucking guy's missing. Missing? What do you mean missing? They told us that he slipped on the ice and broke his ankle, Gillespie replied. Hey, Nick, Rollins said as he slapped Coffer on the back and then sat down next to Gillespie. Jesus, what'd I do? Break up your love fest? You look like you've seen a ghost, Wade. Tell him about Littleman, Gillespie said as he motioned towards Coffer. What, did that guy break both his ankles now? Rollins replied with a light grin. He's missing, Mike. Missing? Lieutenant Page said that he broke his ankle. The operations officer said in this morning's briefing that he and his wife are MIA. Coffer said as the back ramp slammed shut. Hey, look, fellas, I gotta get back up front. I'm sorry to drop that on you. I thought you knew. I'll check with you here in a little bit. Walking back up towards the front of the helicopter, Rollins and Gillespie watched as Coffer stopped and spoke briefly with Lieutenant Page, and then moved up into the front of the aircraft. Sitting back in his seat as the CH-47 roared to life and lifted off the ground, Gillespie once again felt that smothering sense of darkness gripping him even tighter. As the flight time ticked by, Gillespie and Rollins convinced themselves that their friend Coffer must have been mistaken about the name of the lieutenant who had disappeared with his wife. In the middle of speculating who it could really have been, Gillespie stopped, pointed forward, and said, Hey, check it out. Looking forward, Rollins and Gillespie watched as Lieutenant Page was handed a headset by Coffer. After a short conversation into the mic, Lieutenant Page handed the headset back, then turned and looked directly at Rollins and Gillespie. He did not look happy. What do you suppose that was all about? Gillespie pondered. I have a feeling we're about to find out, Rollins replied as he and Gillespie stood, steadying themselves on the swaying aircraft as Lieutenant Page made his way back to them. The two staff sergeants could sense the tension as Lieutenant Page sat down in the seat adjacent to them. What's going on, Lieutenant? Rollins asked as he and Gillespie leaned closer to hear over the engines. I'm not sure what the story is, but it looks like the Air Force crew were headed out to replace us missed their last 2 radio check-ins. One was supposed to be this morning. They've been trying to raise them for the past couple of hours with no luck, Lieutenant Page replied. Radio problems? Rollins asked. I don't know, Lieutenant Page said with a scowl on his face. There's 15 of them with more than one radio on the unit. It would be pretty damn odd for all their commo gear to go down at the same time. Top it all off, apparently there's some weather coming our way as well. What do you want to do, sir? Gillespie asked, hoping that he was not going to hear the ramblings of inexperience and uncertainty come forward. His hopes were fulfilled as Lieutenant Page replied in a seasoned and confident tone. I'm going to have the pilot overfly the landing zone and security camp with a wide circle. Try and get a look before we just touch down. If everything is legit and it is just commo issues, we will go forward with the mission as planned. If not, then when he hit the ground, Gillespie, your squad will secure the LZ and aircraft as our gear is unloaded. Rollins, your squad will come with me. We'll move forward and secure the camp. Both men nodded. Yes, sir. Spread the word that we may be changing plans. I'm going to go forward and talk to the pilot. We should be coming up on it any time, so let's get ready. As Rollins and Gillespie addressed their respective squads about the potential change in plans, Lieutenant Page went forward and talked with the flight crew. Hard left turn! Coffer yelled back to Gillespie and Rollins as the large helicopter banked to the left, flying over the security camp. It looks intact, Gillespie said as he and Rollins looked out the windows on the left side of the helicopter. Yeah, I don't see anyone, though, Rollins replied as the CH-47 leveled off. Plan B, Lieutenant Page announced as he walked back to Rollins and Gillespie. Plan B, get ready. A Squad, you're with me to secure the LZ. B Squad, you're with Staff Sergeant Rollins and Lieutenant Page to patrol forward to the camp. Gillespie yelled as the men of both squads pulled on helmets, gloves, and other gear. 30 seconds, Coffer yelled as he ran to the rear of the helicopter and began lowering the ramp while they were still in flight. 30 seconds, men, Lieutenant Page yelled as he moved towards the ramp. You know what to do. Now let's go do it. Lieutenant Page barked as the large helicopter touched down with a thud, the ramp coming completely open as if it was a choreographed movement. With Lieutenant Page in the lead, both squads rushed out the back of the CH-47 helicopter, setting up a defensive line around the large bird. The tension was palpable as the engines of the Chinooks spooled down. Each man, set in the cool spring Alaska weather, peering down the barrels of their rifles, focusing in on their areas of responsibility. As the engines came to a rest, the prevailing sounds were those of the woods around them. Trees creaking in the wind, birds making their ways back after fleeing from the helicopter, and for each man pulling the stocks of their rifles tight into their shoulder. the sounds of their own breathing. Sprawled out behind his rucksack, Lieutenant Page scanned the area forward of their position with his field glasses. Not seeing anything that raised an alarm for him, he slowly came to a kneeling position and waited with Staff Sergeant Rollins to get B Squad moving. "Calmo check in 5 minutes," Lieutenant Page said in a hushed tone to Sergeant Gillespie as he stood and moved up to join Rollins. Without saying a word, Gillespie turned to his radio man, tapped his ear, and then held up 5 fingers. The radio man nodded, then went back to peering down the barrel of his rifle. Like ghosts in their own right, the men of B Squad moved through the woods, slipping in and out of the sporadic shadows cast through the canopy by the midday sun, slowly closing towards their objective, stopping only for the radio check with A Squad. "What do you think, sir?" Rollins asked as he and Lieutenant Page looked from the relative security of the thick woods down at a clearing and several wooden buildings of obvious government construction. "You see that center building, the larger one with the 2 smaller structures on each side?" Lieutenant Page replied. "Yes, sir. That's the command building. The 4 outbuildings are bunkhouses. Take a fire team, clear the 2 buildings on the left. I'll take the other fire team and clear the other 2. Once we're done with that, we will take care of the larger command building in the center. Leave 1 man from each team behind to button up our 6. As he took one last look through his binoculars, Private First Classes Heron, Ward, and 2 other men moved up behind Lieutenant Page. "Ready, sir," Heron said in a gruff tone as he rolled his shoulders to adjust his gear. An uneasy chill ran through Heron's body as Lieutenant Page turned and looked right at him, his eyes almost taking on a dark gray appearance as they seemed to shimmer in the shadows of the trees. Just for a split second, Heron heard what sounded like people screaming in pain far off, screams that seemed to be carried on the wind. He exhaled, and in that same second saw a shadow ran across Lieutenant Page's face, revealing a grin that would rival that of any serial killer. "Let's move up," Lieutenant Page said as he stood, and along with the rest of the fire team moved towards the first bunkhouse on their side of the command building. The entire fire team that was, except for Heron, who was still just kneeling in the same position trying to get past what he had just seen and heard. "Get up," Ward hissed as he grabbed his friend Heron by the back of his load-bearing vest and pulled him to his feet. "Come on, goddammit," Ward yelled as he pulled Heron out of the woods and up to the rest of the fire team that had stopped just short of the door to the first bunkhouse. Just as they got into the stack, Lieutenant Page and the rest of the team made their entry and started flowing through the single-level multi-room building. Moving slowly, methodically, looking for any signs of anything, the men moved through the various rooms of the building in teams of 2, with the odd man watching areas of the building they had not yet secured. "Clear! Coming out!" Ward barked as he and Heron moved from the final room in the building. "Anything?" Lieutenant Page asked as the team assembled back by the front door. "No, sir," Ward replied. "It's as if no one was ever here. All the chairs are pushed into the desks, windows are all closed, no sign of habitation at all." "Okay, let's go to the next building. Same drill, same assignments." As the men filed past, Lieutenant Page reached out and grabbed Heron and pulled him aside. "Heron, are you okay?" Swallowing hard and trying not to look as scared as he was, Heron just nodded. "Yes, sir. I'm sorry about back there. I don't know what happened." "Listen to me. We got ourselves a stressful situation here. I need you to lock your shit down tight. You got me?" "Yes, sir," Heron replied. The search of the second building went exactly like the first. Once finished, Lieutenant Page and his fire team moved to the last building, the command building, where they linked back up with Staff Sergeant Rollins and his team. As they moved up, Lieutenant Page looked directly at Rollins, who just shook his head in the negative. Positioning themselves to make entry into the 2-level command building, Lieutenant Page again looked at Rollins. "You find the stairs and take your team up. I'll clear the bottom." Rollins just nodded, turned to the man behind him, and whispered that they were going up. That soldier did the same until the last man in the stack got the word that they were going to the upstairs. Lieutenant Page and his team entered into the building first, with Rollins and his team right behind. They moved slowly and methodically until they found the stairwell leading up, where Rollins and his team broke off from Lieutenant Page. Rollins and one of his men moved up the stairs, just short of the landing so that they could see up the second flight. The other 2 men held position at the base of the stairs as Lieutenant Page and his team finished sweeping the downstairs. Once they were done, and circled back around to the stairs, Rollins and his men began moving up the stairs to the second level as Lieutenant Page and his team secured the stairwell. "Lieutenant, I think we got something up here," Rollins barked. "Hold your positions," Lieutenant Page ordered as he jumped up the stairs past Ward, Heron, and the rest of his fire team. "Over here, sir," Rollins called as Lieutenant Page walked into the large open space room. There were several 6-foot-long tables set up in the middle of the room with workstations that appeared to have never been worked at. As he walked over, Rollins held up a yellow No. 2 pencil he had found at one of the workstations. Taking the pencil from Rollins, he saw that it was full of teeth marks as if someone had been chewing on it. "That's not all," Rollins said in a heavy tone. Looking at the chewed pencil with a scowl on his face, Lieutenant Page dropped it onto the table in front of him and said, "Show me." "Sergeant Mickles found it when he and his partner cleared these rooms over here," Rollins said as he pulled open the door to a small utility closet. "Jesus!" Lieutenant Page muttered as he ran his fingertips tracing down the inside of the door what looked like claw marks. "Lieutenant, Staff Sergeant, you guys better come take a look at this over here," Sergeant Mickles hollered from across the large open room. "What the fuck? Is that blood?" Rollins remarked as he and Lieutenant Page walked into another office off the main room. "We found it during the secondary sweep, sir. We missed it the first time because it's so low to the ground," Mickles said as he shined his flashlight on what looked to be several phrases scrawled in blood on the wall of the office just above floor level. "Is that Latin?" Mickles asked as he leaned in to get a closer look at the writings. "Looks like it," Lieutenant Page replied as he shined his light on the wall. "Sir, if I may suggest, Gillespie studied Latin as part of his seminary school," Rollins said as he also looked closer at the writing. Turning from the writings they had found, Lieutenant Page looked at Rollins with a curious yet slightly agitated look on his face. "Staff Sergeant Gillespie is a priest?" "No, sir," Rollins replied. "He was studying to be one, then had some sort of a falling out with the school he was at, left there and joined the army." "Okay, if everything's secure there, let's get him up here to take a look at this. Have the rest of your squad start checking all the other offices, doors, everything, for any more markings, symbols, anything." "Yes, sir," Rollins replied as he stepped away to go find his radio man. "Rollins," Lieutenant Page yelled, "keep this in-house. The Chinook crew doesn't need to know. Also, see if they got a weather update." "Will do, sir." As Rollins walked off, Lieutenant Page made his way to one of the chairs in the corner of the large open room. Sitting down, he took a drink of water from his canteen, smiled, and shook his head. Leaning back in the chair, he rubbed his eyes and muttered to himself with a slight chuckle, "A fucking priest." And that is the end of Chapter 1. I hope you all enjoyed this one. If you did, please feel free to check out the author's page, which I will leave a link to in the description down below. And if you're curious to check out more of this afterwards, please pick up this book. And if you really want to hear more of my thoughts on it, I have also constructed a review of this as well. Please feel free to let me know your thoughts on this episode of Let's Read. If you enjoyed it, please stick around for more. I guarantee you will not be disappointed. In the meantime, thank you so much for listening. This is Rambling Collector, signing off for now, and hope you all have a great day, fellow readers. I will see you all in the next video.